Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Imagine believing you have found, the perfect safe shortcut to quit a deadly habit.
Right. You've traded the harsh, burning reality of tobacco smoke for something that feels entirely different.
Exactly. It's sleek, it's modern, and it produces this colorful, fruity vapor that smells like vanilla or mango or mint.
And you tell yourself that you are just inhaling a harmless water vapor.
Because, the marketing campaigns have certainly told you that over the years. You think you've finally beaten the system.
You've kept the physical habit and the nicotine, but you've supposedly stripped away the danger.
But what if, decades later, you discover that you were just trading one profound risk for another? What if history is repeating itself right under our noses, and that sweet-smelling cloud is masking a devastatingly complex chemical reaction happening inside the deepest tissues of your lungs?
Well, the psychological relief of that switch is exactly why these devices integrated so rapidly into daily life all over the globe.
We embraced a technology based on an implicit promise of safety, didn't we?
We did. But the biological reality of what happens when that heated chemical aerosol meets human tissue is only just now coming into full focus. We are moving from assumptions to observable microscopic proof.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are taking you on a journey past the bright packaging, the targeted marketing, and the pervasive myths that have surrounded e-cigarettes for the last 20 years.
We are looking directly at the underlying science to uncover whether vaping independently causes cancer.
To do this, we are drawing on two incredibly critical sources. The first is a health news article published by Medical Express on March 30, 2026.
And the second is the foundation of that news, which is a comprehensive, peer-reviewed scientific paper published in the journal Carcinogenesis titled The Carcinogenicity of E-Cigarettes, a Qualitative Risk Assessment.
Our mission today is to strip away the dense scientific jargon and explain exactly what is happening inside the human body when a person vapes. Okay, let's unpack this.
To truly understand the magnitude of this 2026 study, we have to look at how the scientific community has historically viewed e-cigarettes.
Right, because for years, the primary concern was whether vaping acted as a gateway to traditional smoking.
Exactly. The dominant fear was always that teenagers would start with flavored vapes, become addicted to the nicotine, and then eventually transition to combustible tobacco.
And while that gateway effect is very real, it created a massive scientific blind spot, didn't it?
It really did. The research energy was directed at behavioral pathways rather than the biological impact of the vapor itself. But this new research flips the script entirely.
How so?
While the researchers asked a much more terrifying question. Does vaping cause cancer in its own right, completely independent of tobacco use?
Oh, wow. That is a massive distinction. We are no longer just talking about stepping stones. We are talking about the destination itself.
Precisely. But proving that is incredibly complex.
I would imagine so.
Yeah.
If you are trying to isolate the effects of vaping from everything else a person's exposed to, you need a very specific way of filtering the data.
Whether that is secondhand smoke, environmental pollution, or their own previous smoking history, the methodology is the bedrock of their conclusion.
So how did they actually set out to prove this independent risk?
The research team conducted what is known as a qualitative risk assessment. Instead of trying to run one single isolated experiment, they pulled together a vast body of global research.
But they restricted their overarching review to publications released from 2017 to 2025, right?
Yes, and they did this specifically to avoid selection bias. By focusing on this specific 8-year window, they ensured they were looking at the most modern, comprehensive data available.
Which helps avoid the temptation to cherry-pick older, perhaps less rigorous studies from the early days of e-cigarettes when the devices were fundamentally different.
Exactly. They examined clinical monitoring of humans, extensive animal bioassays, and highly detailed mechanistic data.
And mechanistic data is basically the study of how specific chemicals behave and cause damage at the microscopic cellular level.
Right. And synthesizing all of that requires an incredibly diverse team. You cannot just have one type of scientist looking at this if you want a definitive answer.
Right. It was a massive collaborative effort led by the University of New South Wales.
Spearheaded by adjunct professor Bernard Stewart and associate professor Freddie Sidis. They brought in experts from across the medical spectrum,
including minds from the University of Queensland, Flinders University, the University of Sydney, and multiple major hospitals.
The team included pharmacists, epidemiologists, thoracic surgeons, and public health researchers.
That makes a lot of sense. A pharmacist understands the chemical breakdown of the liquid in the cartridge.
And a thoracic surgeon is the one actually opening up a chest cavity and looking at the physical tissue damage in the lungs.
While an epidemiologist tracks the disease trends across massive populations over time. When experts from all these distinct fields examine the evidence, and they all arrive at the exact same conclusion regarding cancer risk, the consensus becomes incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
So, what is the definitive bottom line they arrived at?
Based on this exhaustive review, the researchers state that nicotine-based e-cigarettes are likely to cause lung cancer and oral cancer in humans.
That is heavy. The global data has officially moved from a cautious stance of needing more evidence to notifying profound concern about carcinogenicity today.
It has, but I know this brings up a lot of questions about the timeline.
Yeah, I need to push back on the timeline of this realization. The marketing has been telling us since the early 2000s that these devices are therapeutic quitting aids.
They were explicitly framed as the safer alternative for over 2 decades.
Right. So if the independent cancer risk is this pronounced, how did the entire global public health apparatus miss it for so long?
Well, it really comes down to the latency period of cancer. Cancer does not develop overnight from a single exposure.
It takes decades of repeated cellular damage, mutation, and slow tumor growth before a disease becomes clinically apparent across a wide population.
Exactly. When e-cigarettes were introduced 20 years ago, we simply did not have 20 years of data.
We had short-term toxicity data showing they did not kill cells immediately in a petri dish in the exact same way a cigarette did.
But we lacked the long-term epidemiological proof of what happens over decades. And the marketing industry exploited that lack of long-term data by filling the void with the word safer.
But safer than smoking is an incredibly low bar. I mean, it is like saying jumping out of a second-story window is safer than jumping out of a 10th-story window.
That is a great way to put it. You are still going to break your legs.
Right. So while society was coasting on this assumption of safety, the cellular evidence of harm was quietly accumulating. To understand the true danger, we have to zoom way in. What is actually happening to a teenager's cells when they inhale that vapor?
What's fascinating here is the physical mechanics of the device itself, because the danger does not just come from the liquid inside the pod. It comes from the hardware.
The battery and the coil.
Right.
Yes.
An e-cigarette contains a battery, a reservoir for the liquid, and a metallic heating coil, often connected by soldered joints.
And to create the vapor, that metallic coil has to heat up dramatically and repeatedly.
Which means, as it heats and cools hundreds of times a week, it experiences thermal fatigue. It does not just vaporize the liquid, the metal itself begins to degrade and microscopic fissures form.
That makes me think of having an old rusty metal kettle on your stove.
Oh, that's an excellent analogy.
Every time you boil water for your tea, the heat causes the degrading metal on the inside of the kettle to flake off. You cannot see it with the naked eye, but with every cup you drink, you are swallowing microscopic, jagged shards of rust and metal.
But there is a massive biological difference here.
Because if I drink water from a rusty kettle, it goes into my stomach. My stomach is a highly acidic environment designed by evolution to dissolve contaminants and break down food.
Exactly. But when you vape, you are pulling those degrading metal shards directly into the delicate, highly sensitive, permeable tissue of your lungs.
Which is designed exclusively for exchanging gases, not processing heavy metals.
And the clinical data from the 2017 to 2025 review supports exactly that mechanical degradation.
What exactly did they find in the clinical studies?
Studies analyzing the aerosols produced by these devices, as well as the biological fluids of the users themselves, have found significant levels of toxic metals.
We are talking about chromium, nickel, cadmium, and lead being deposited directly into the respiratory system, right?
Yes. One specific study highlighted in the review found significantly elevated nickel concentrations in the biological samples of e-cigarette users compared to non-smokers.
And the tissue in the lungs has no defense mechanism for heavy metal accumulation.
None at all. The biological response to that invasion is severe, leading directly to a state of oxidative stress.
Okay, let us break down oxidative stress, because that is a term that gets thrown around in health circles a lot, usually followed by someone trying to sell you blueberry supplements.
Right. It has become quite the buzzword.
The sources mention it heavily, so we need to explain the mechanics of what oxidative stress actually means for the human body without drowning in chemistry jargon.
Well, my understanding is that it revolves around free radicals.
Right. Imagine a free radical as a car driving down the highway at 80 miles an hour, but it is missing a wheel. It is wildly unstable,
And to stabilize itself, it violently crashes into the car next to it.
which is a healthy cell. It crashes just to steal its wheel. Now that cell is stabilized, but the cell it crashed into is missing a wheel, so it crashes into the next one.
It is a microscopic chain reaction of structural damage sweeping through your tissue.
And that structural damage is precisely what the researchers are tracking, isn't it?
Biologically, yes. The chemicals and heavy metals in the vapor introduce these highly reactive, unstable molecules into the respiratory system,
And the body tries to fight back with its own internal mechanics, which are antioxidants.
which act like mechanics on the highway, offering spare tires to the unstable cars before they crash. But the sheer volume of unstable molecules introduced by vaping completely overwhelms the body's antioxidant defenses.
The sources point to a specific byproduct of this microscopic chain reaction called lipid peroxidation. Let's follow that chain reaction.
Well, the cell membrane, the protective outer wall of the cell, is made of lipids, which are essentially fats.
And when these unstable free radicals crash into those fats, they break the chemical bonds. They compromise the structural integrity of the cell wall.
It is like punching microscopic holes in a water balloon. The cell starts leaking, it cannot function properly, and it leaves behind chemical debris.
And the researchers can actually measure that debris, right?
They can. When lipid peroxidation occurs, it leaves behind a specific marker called 8-isoprostane.
So, clinical tests detailed in the review clearly show increased levels of these 8-isoprostane markers in the urine and saliva of e-cigarette users.
Exactly. This is not theoretical damage happening in a test tube. It is observable, measurable degradation happening in living human beings right now.
And the damage does not stop at the outer wall of the cell, does it?
No, the resulting inflammation and chemical chaos penetrate deeply into the core infrastructure. The sources talk extensively about damage to deoxyribonucleic acid, our genetic blueprint.
The moment we start talking about damage to our genetic blueprint, the conversation about cancer risk goes from a distant possibility to a mechanical reality.
Without a doubt. The research highlights numerous clinical studies showing that e-cigarette users have significantly higher levels of specific genetic damage compared to non-users.
They're finding adducts, right?
Yes. An adduct is a toxic chemical that has successfully penetrated the cell and physically attached itself to a segment of the genetic sequence.
And by attaching itself, it interferes with how the cell reads its own blueprint, which directly causes mutations when the cell tries to divide and replicate.
Furthermore, the studies show profound epigenetic changes.
I want to spend some time on epigenetics because it is the key to understanding how a tumor actually starts. Epigenetics controls how genes are turned on or off.
Right. We all have genes that tell our cells when to grow and genes that tell them when to stop growing and die, which is a normal, healthy process.
But the data reveals altered gene expression in vapors, specifically mentioning something called hypermethylation of certain genes linked to carcinogenesis.
Let's translate hypermethylation for the audience.
Imagine your genetic code is an instruction manual for the cell. Methylation is a normal process, but hypermethylation is like spilling thick black ink over the specific pages that tell the cell how to stop growing.
The instructions are still technically there in the book, but the cell cannot read them anymore.
Because it can no longer read the instruction to stop, the cell just keeps multiplying endlessly.
Which is the exact mechanical definition of how a tumor forms. And the clinical data shows that in e-cigarette users, this exact process is occurring.
Did they observe any other changes in the genes?
They also observed the upregulation of tumor suppressor genes. This means the body recognizes that tumors are beginning to form, and it is frantically activating its defense genes trying to fight off the rogue cell division.
So the body is in a state of chronic, microscopic warfare.
Precisely.
We have to talk about the specific chemicals driving this genetic damage, because they are brilliantly hidden behind harmless-sounding nostalgic names.
Oh, absolutely. The flavorings.
Right. We walk into a store and see flavorings like vanillin or ethyl maltol, which sound like ingredients you would find in a bakery or your grandmother's kitchen. It creates a powerful psychological shield.
Because if it tastes like a cupcake, how could it possibly cause genetic mutation?
Exactly.
Well, the flavorings are the ultimate Trojan horse. While vanillin might be perfectly safe to eat in a cookie, your digestive system and your respiratory system operate on entirely different mechanical principles.
When you eat a cookie, your stomach uses specialized enzymes to slowly break down the vanillin molecule over several hours.
But an e-cigarette does not use enzymes. It uses extreme heat.
And when these flavoring chemicals are exposed to a metallic coil, heating up to 400 degrees, they undergo a process called thermal decomposition.
The heat violently rips the chemical structure of the vanillin apart, forcing the atoms to recombine into entirely new, highly toxic substances called volatile organic compounds.
So you are starting with a bakery ingredient, but the thermal shock is transforming it into an industrial hazard.
Yes. The researchers specifically identified volatile organic compounds like acrolein, formaldehyde, and benzene in the vapor.
And just to be completely clear for anyone listening, these volatile organic compounds are not naturally occurring byproducts of human respiration. These are severe industrial chemicals.
Benzene, for example, is a chemical found in crude oil and gasoline.
And formaldehyde is famously used as an industrial fungicide, an embalming fluid, and in the manufacturing of building materials.
Acrolein is perhaps the most concerning. It is used commercially as a highly toxic pesticide to kill weeds and algae.
And its toxicity is so severe, it was actually weaponized and used as a chemical warfare agent in World War I, right?
That is correct. When heated, the combination of the carrier liquids like propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, along with the artificial flavorings, creates a highly toxic chemical soup.
And the clinical data shows that these specific volatile organic compounds, along with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, contribute directly to cytotoxicity.
Cytotoxicity simply means cell death. When this vapor washes over the tissue, it destroys the cells lining the mouth, the throat, and the lungs.
It also severely disrupts the respiratory immune system, doesn't it?
It does. The specialized cells responsible for clearing out mucus and fighting off bacterial infections are paralyzed or killed, making the user significantly more vulnerable to chronic infections on top of the cancer risk.
I want to pause here and speak directly to you, especially if you are a parent trying to understand what your teenager's doing, or if you are a teenager navigating a landscape where everyone seems to have one of these devices in their pocket.
The marketing has been incredibly effective.
It has convinced millions of people that because it tastes like tropical fruit, and because it does not leave the heavy, lingering smell of an ashtray on your clothes or in your car, it is inherently clean.
But the reality exposed by this research is that the colorful, fruity flavor is actively masking a process that is fundamentally altering your genetic repair systems.
Young users are pulling heavy metals from degrading heating coils and industrial chemicals from the thermal breakdown of the liquid directly into their respiratory tracts.
It is causing the cells in their mouths and lungs to mutate, to leak, and to die.
It is an invisible, microscopic assault on the body's fundamental building blocks, and the clinical observations back this up with sobering, undeniable reality.
The review paper actually discusses specific case reports of oral carcinomas, which is mouth cancer, emerging in e-cigarette users.
There is a deeply concerning case of a 19-year-old male with an extensive daily history of vaping who developed an aggressive squamous cell carcinoma of the oral cavity.
And given the extreme rarity of that specific type of cancer in such a young patient, and the total absence of other traditional risk factors like human papillomavirus infections or tobacco chewing, the authors note that the thermal and chemical trauma from e-cigarette use was the likely catalyst.
Another case detailed in the literature involved a 51-year-old man who developed an aggressive squamous cell lung carcinoma after 11 years of exclusive e-cigarette use.
So we have the mechanical evidence, we know the metal degrades, we know the heat creates formaldehyde, and we see the genetic markers of tumor growth in the saliva.
We're also seeing these terrifying, isolated human case reports. So the cellular damage is undeniable. But what happens when we look at the whole organism over time? And what happens if someone vapes and smokes?
Well, to answer what happens to the whole organism, the researchers looked at extensive in vivo animal studies.
Because ethically, you cannot take a group of perfectly healthy humans, lock them in a room, and expose them to a novel chemical aerosol for a year to see if they develop cancer.
Exactly. That is why the scientific community relies on highly controlled laboratory environments. One pivotal study highlighted in the review involved a large cohort of mice.
The researchers exposed one group of mice to e-cigarette aerosols for 54 weeks. We need to put 54 weeks into the proper context because a year might not sound like a long time to a human.
But the average lifespan of a laboratory mouse is roughly 2 years.
So exposing them to this aerosol for 54 weeks means they were breathing this chemical soup for nearly half of their entire existence.
It is the biological equivalent of a human vaping every single day for 30 or 40 years.
And they were not just puffing on it once a day. They were exposed for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, simulating the constant habitual use we see in humans.
The parameters were strictly designed to mimic human exposure levels, and the results of that chronic exposure were definitive.
What were the specific numbers?
Among the mice exposed to the nicotine-based e-cigarette aerosol, 22.5% developed lung adenocarcinomas.
Those are fully formed actual lung tumors.
Yes, and to understand the significance of that, we have to look at the control group. The researchers had a secondary group of mice living in the exact same laboratory conditions, eating the same diet, but breathing ambient filtered air.
In that control group, only 1 out of 40 mice, which is 2.5%, developed a tumor over their lifespan.
So you were jumping from a natural biological baseline of 2.5% to nearly a quarter of the subjects developing lung cancer solely from the introduction of the vapor.
A jump from 2.5% to 22.5% is a staggering leap. It completely obliterates the argument that the tissue damage is just a minor reversible irritation.
And it wasn't just the lungs that were affected. The chemical cascade moved through the entire body.
The researchers also conducted full autopsies on the subjects, right?
They did, and they found hyperplastic changes, which is a state of abnormal accelerated cell growth that very often precedes full-blown cancer.
And where did they find these changes?
In the bladder urothelium of 57.5% of the aerosol-exposed mice.
This is a critical finding because it proves that the volatile organic compounds, the heavy metals, and the carcinogenic metabolites do not just stay localized in the lung tissue.
Exactly. Once they enter the lungs, they cross the barrier into the bloodstream. They're circulated through every organ in the body, processed by the kidneys, and sit in the bladder before being excreted.
The damage is completely systemic. This systemic damage brings us to a massive behavioral reality that completely complicates the public health response.
You're talking about the dual-use issue.
Yes. The initial defense of these devices, the moral shield they hid behind, was always the claim that they were a transitional tool to stop smoking combustible cigarettes.
But if you walk down the street in any major city, you see a completely different reality.
You see people doing both. They vape in the office, in the airport, or at the train station where they cannot legally or socially smoke a cigarette.
Then the moment they step outside or get into their car, they light up a traditional cigarette.
Right. It's so common now.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are looking at a phenomenon the researchers accurately term dual-use limbo.
Because the initial promise of the technology was total replacement, but the behavioral reality is augmentation.
People are not shaking off the habit. They are simply adding a highly convenient, socially acceptable new delivery system to their existing addiction.
And the epidemiological evidence regarding this dual use is perhaps the most frightening data point in the entire risk assessment. I have always assumed that dual use was at least a step in the right direction from a harm reduction standpoint.
A lot of people assume that.
The logic seems to dictate that if you are vaping for half the day instead of smoking, you are cutting your tar and combustible chemical intake in half, so your overall cancer risk must be proportionally reduced.
But the data utterly demolishes that assumption.
Does it actually support any harm reduction at all?
Not at all. Recent epidemiological evidence from the United States, analyzed in the review, reveals that individuals who both vape and smoke face an additional fourfold increased risk of developing lung cancer compared to someone who exclusively smokes cigarettes.
Let me state that again for clarity. Using both devices does not halve your risk. It multiplies your risk of lung cancer by 4 compared to just smoking tobacco.
It's a staggering statistic.
If these devices trap users in a dual-use limbo where they face quadruple the cancer risk, how can any public health framework continue to allow the terminology of safer alternative to exist? Doesn't that completely invalidate their classification as a safer alternative?
It absolutely challenges the foundation of how these products have been regulated, taxed, and perceived by the public.
Because the compounding behavior is drastically accelerating the disease process. You have the specific genetic damage caused by the heavy metals, the thermal breakdown of the liquid in the vape, colliding with the massive established carcinogen load of combustible tobacco.
It creates a perfect biological storm for cellular mutation. The dual-use data destroys the harm reduction narrative for a massive segment of the population.
We are no longer talking about harm reduction. We are talking about risk multiplication, which means we are watching a public health crisis unfold in real time, in slow motion, despite all the microscopic and behavioral evidence warning us.
And looking at how society is reacting, or rather failing to react, feels eerily familiar.
Very familiar.
This raises an important question. Why is society so slow to accept this reality when the biochemical mechanisms are so clear?
To understand our current paralysis, Associate Professor Freddie Sidis and Professor Bernard Stewart took a step back and traced the historical parallels between early tobacco research and our current situation with vaping.
The history of smoking research is actually wild when you look back at it.
We tend to think of the anti-smoking campaigns of the 1980s and 90s, and we assume the science was always settled. We forget how long the battle actually took.
It took nearly a century of rigorous, embattled scientific investigation. From the mid-1800s, when automated cigarette rolling machines were invented and mass consumption began, all the way to the landmark United States Surgeon General's report in 1964.
So for decades, science was struggling to officially, legally recognize smoking as a cause of lung cancer.
During that massive stretch of time, doctors literally prescribed cigarettes for sore throats. The early warning signs were constantly dismissed, debated, or deliberately obscured by industry-funded counter-research.
The sources mentioned that early reports linked smoking to infectious diseases long before they could definitively prove the cancer link, right?
Yes. Before the cancer connection was solidified with undeniable epidemiological proof, early data in the 1920s and 30s pointed to a link between smoking and tuberculosis, then cardiovascular disease and stroke.
The cancer link took the longest to prove unequivocally because of the decades-long latency period we discussed earlier. You needed millions of people to smoke for 30 years before the data became mathematically undeniable.
Exactly. And the researchers in this 2026 study are watching the exact same historical pattern unfold with vaping.
Over the last 10 years, we've already seen the links to cardiovascular issues, the severe respiratory inflammation, the severe vaping-associated lung injury outbreaks, and the immune suppression.
Now, the cancer data is finally emerging. As Professor Sidis states, e-cigarettes were introduced about 20 years ago. We cannot afford to wait another 80 years, while millions of people unknowingly mutate their cells to decide what to do.
We should not repeat the fatal delay of the 20th century. But the researchers do acknowledge that their current study has limitations.
They do. And if we're going to maintain scientific integrity, we have to be completely impartial about what the data can and cannot do right now.
Scientific integrity demands addressing limitations head-on. The experts make it very clear that their assessment is a qualitative risk assessment, not a quantitative numerical estimate of the total cancer burden.
Meaning they can say with absolute mechanical confidence that it causes cancer based on the cellular damage and animal models.
But they cannot yet look at the global population and say exactly how many people will develop cancer over the next 50 years.
Because the massive widespread adoption of vaping, especially the explosion among young people and teenagers, has really only peaked over the last decade.
So we lack the 50-year long-term human epidemiological data required to calculate an exact percentage of risk across the global population.
It will take decades to accumulate the human body count required for a purely quantitative numerical estimate. But the core argument of this paper is that waiting for those bodies to pile up in oncology wards before acting is a profound failure of public health and morality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We are witnessing a massive paradigm shift in how the scientific community handles emerging threats.
The language in the peer-reviewed literature between 2017 and 2025 shifted dramatically.
It moved from a cautious, traditional, we need more long-term evidence to determine if this is dangerous, to an urgent, table-pounding, we need to sound the alarm immediately based on the mechanisms we are observing.
They're looking at the degrading heavy metals from the coils, the structural deoxyribonucleic acid damage, the lung tumors in the 54-week mouse studies, and the terrifying four-fold risk multiplier for dual users.
And they are saying the evidence is already unequivocal. We do not need 50 years of human casualty data to know that inhaling formaldehyde, benzene, and heavy metals directly into lung tissue causes cellular mutation.
The mechanics alone dictate the outcome. That is the crux of why a qualitative assessment is so powerful today.
When every single biological mechanism points toward tumor development, you do not need to wait for the tumor to appear on a patient's X-ray to know the risk is real.
The chemical biomarkers of oxidative stress in the urine, the epigenetic hypermethylation shutting down tumor suppressor genes in the saliva, the total destruction of the oral microbiome, and the systemic hyperplastic changes in animal models.
It all tells the exact same undeniable story. So what does this all mean? Let us distill this down to the core reality.
Vaping is not just a gateway to tobacco.
The scientific consensus, built by multidisciplinary experts synthesizing years of global data, is that the heavy metals from the thermally fatigued heating coils, the complex thermal breakdown of bakery flavor chemicals into industrial toxins, and the resulting genetic mutations present a clear, independent, and highly likely cause of lung and oral cancer.
It is not harmless water vapor. It is a highly reactive, structurally destructive chemical aerosol that completely overwhelms your cell's biological ability to repair themselves.
And if you are caught in that dual-use limbo, using it to quit smoking but inevitably ending up using both, you are multiplying your chances of developing lung cancer by 4.
That is the hard truth of the data.
If you take nothing else away from this deep dive, let it be this. You are armed with the biological truth now. If you are a parent watching your kids, a teenager navigating peer pressure, or just someone moving through a world where these colorful devices are ubiquitous, you need to have a transparent, science-based conversation about this.
Look past the sleek marketing and the nostalgic flavors. Talk about the mechanics of the heating coils.
Talk about the heavy metals flaking off into the lungs. Talk about the volatile organic compounds and the irreversible genetic changes happening at a microscopic level.
We have to move entirely beyond the dangerous, historically naive myth that safer than smoking means safe.
The science has spoken on the mechanism of harm. The final burden of disease cannot yet be perfectly quantified in human lives, but the biological reality of the damage is no longer in question.
It's a reality we all have to face now.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over. We engineered these highly sophisticated modern devices specifically to cure a century-old addiction to combustible tobacco.
We used our best technology to try and hack our way out of a public health disaster.
But if the very technology we created to save ourselves ends up causing the exact same cellular destruction, just through a different chemical pathway, are we biologically and psychologically destined to keep inventing new, highly profitable ways to package and inhale the exact same risks?
You thought you found the perfect, safe shortcut out of the woods, only to realize the shortcut leads to the exact same cliff.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.